Hi, I'm Bill Bragan, Executive Artistic Director of the Arts Center at NYU Abu Dhabi. Welcome to our collaboration with the NYUAD Institute for As Far as Isolation Goes, a talk with Tania El Khoury, moderated by Joanna. This year, NYU Abu Dhabi celebrates its 10th year, and it's significant that the NYUAD Institute is celebrating its 12th anniversary. From the inception of the university, even before we had students, the NYUAD Institute has been bringing talks to the public from scholars, artists, researchers, and thought leaders of all types. And they really paved the way for us at the Arts Center to extend that tradition. We're grateful to Philip Kennedy, Nahed Ahmed, and everyone at the Institute for their partnership. Each year, we collaborate on a few programs that feature artists from the Arts Center, since our artists meet these criteria. They are makers, scholars, researchers, and thought leaders, such as today's speakers, Tania El Khoury and Joanna. We're entering the last week of a sold-out month of performances of Tania's piece with Basel Zara, As Far as Isolation Goes, so we're grateful to have the opportunity to be able to extend the reach of her residency through this forum. We're also grateful to our faculty colleagues at NYUAD who have intersected with Tania's work during this virtual residency in 17 classes. For those of you who are interested in other artists who are innovating in new forms of microtheater that speak to this very particular moment we're living in, I hope you'll join the Art Center for 600 Highwaymen's 1,000 Ways Part 1, which opens on October 7th. It's a telephone-based piece for 2 audience members at a time. And now to introduce our moderator. Joanna is a theater and opera director committed to large and small scale electric existential work. Based in Abu Dhabi, she spent her creative formative years in the New York City downtown scene, working with Mabel Minds, Richard Foreman's Ontological Hysteric, Here Art Center, and the Public Theater. She's a graduate of Hampshire College and the Juilliard School. Her recent productions include Sky on Swings, a new opera about Alzheimer's disease by Lembit Beecher and Hannah Moscovich, presented by Opera Philadelphia, and Nora by Heather Raffo, presented by Shakespeare Theater of DC, Playwrights Horizon in New York City, and right here at the Arts Center. Settle's direction of the collaboratively developed Al Rahil, Departure was commissioned by the Arts Center and Cultural Foundation and premiered at the Arts Center in January. The work is a contemporary performance event in Arabic and English, created with Emirati poet Reem Al-Manhali. Joanna is an arts professor of theater and head of the theater program here at NYUAD. Please welcome my good friend and colleague, Joanna.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Tania, for being here. Thank you, Arts Center and the Institute for making this work possible. I have the great pleasure of introducing Tania. Tania El Khoury, if you don't know, is a live artist creating installations and performances focused on audience interactivity and concerned with the ethical and political potential of such encounters. She's a distinguished artist in residence of theater and performance and co-director of the Masters in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College in New York. Her work has been presented in multiple languages across 6 continents. She was a 2019 Soros Art Fellow and the recipient of the Bessie's Outstanding Production Award, the International Live Art Prize, the Total Theater Innovation Award, and the Arches Brick Award. Tania holds a PhD in Performance Studies from Royal Holloway, University of London. She is associated with Forest Fringe Collective of Artists in the UK and is a co-founder of Dictaphone Group in Lebanon, a research and performance collective aiming at questioning our relationship to the city and redefining its public spaces. Tania, hello and welcome.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you, everyone, for being with us and for the Art Center for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to chat with Joanna, whom I love and love her work and find very inspiring. Yeah, I'm very sad that I'm not with you in person. Last time I was at the Art Center, this is when we all became friends and we had lots of fun. And I got to engage with the communities of students and artists in a live manner, but this is good enough for now. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and welcome to the audience again. It is really great to have everyone here. And Tania, we will take you however we can get you, live, zoomed in, whatever it takes. I think maybe we can talk first about the journey of As Far as Isolation Goes, which is currently performing at the Arts Center. I first saw the piece when in its first version, As Far as My Fingertips Take Me. And I know it's now in its third iteration. Can you talk a little bit about that and the journey of the piece?
Yeah, totally. We can actually show a little clip of the first iteration of that work soon. So the piece started in 2016. That was my first collaboration with Bassel Zarra, who's a Palestinian, Syrian, now British artist and musician. We created a one-on-one, well, actually, I was commissioned to make a piece for a Lift Festival and Royal Court Theatre about the issue of migration. That was in 2016. And I thought it wasn't my own story to tell. And second, that this is as a response to the art world suddenly wanting to talk about refugees and migration. I felt it was important to think together that this is not a new contemporary issue only, that they're in the context of an example of Palestinians, for example, there have been refugees, millions have been made refugees, and they continue to be as such for decades. So it was important to talk about that. And I invited Bassel Zarra to perform in that piece. And the premise of the piece that it was a 10-minute, intimate, tactile, and sonor audio encounter between Bassel, as someone who is born a refugee, and the audience, one audience at a time. So it's a one-on-one piece. Through a gallery wall, the audience is invited to stick their arm into a hole in the wall, and Bassel touches their arm without them seeing them. So there is there should be a shared trust there, and also a relationship that is built without necessarily seeing each other. They listen through a pair of headphones, an introduction by Bassel, but also a rap song that he created, inspired by the journey that his sisters made from Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus to Sweden. And then at the very end, there is a possibility for them to meet on one side of the wall or not, depends on people. And then in 2019, last year, we were invited by another festival, the Sick of the Fringe and Welcome Trust Foundation in London, to recreate that piece, and this time reflecting on the mental and physical health of refugees. So what happens to them after they make that journey, when they resettle, how they might feel isolated because the new political or social context doesn't take into consideration their journeys, their own realities, where they come from, etc. So we made an iteration of that piece where the drawing changes, the wall is different, and the audience is invited at the end to add their own thoughts on the wall. And this was due to be performed continue to tour this year. And just before, just a bit before it was due to go to Ireland, there was a lockdown in Ireland, and the Gift Festival asked us if we would be happy to do an online version of the work. Now, my own reaction at first, thinking like, how can we do a tactile, intimate, one-on-one piece, turn it into some online version? And then continuing the conversation with Bassel, we decided that it might be actually interesting to think about isolation now when everyone is living a sort of isolated reality because of COVID, because of borders being shut for different reasons, but it's still a sort of isolation that people are living. And we just adapted that piece to be online, and we added this kind of link with the isolation that we now live in because of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's such an, I've seen, I didn't see the middle version, but I've seen the other two, and well, let's share a clip that shows a little bit about that first version. Let's see here.
My name is Baz. I'm sitting on the other side of the wall. Please, place your left arm in the hole in the wall in front of you. This is me, touching your arm.
بجمعي وانا وحاي وذاب الصخر من همي وانا وحايا يا ويلي ترابي تعود يا يما وانا وحاي سفيني غرقت بجمعي وانا وحاي وذاب الصخر من همي بجمعي بتعود وانا وحاي وذاب الصخر من همي وانا وحايا يا ويلي وانا وحايا يا ويلي ترابي تعود يا يما وانا وحاي سفيني غرقت بجمعي وانا وحاي وذاب ترابي تعود يا يما وانا
watching the kids from the balcony, smell of your skin next to me. We only want what everyone wants.
I mean, it was so, it's moving again to see it. It's so beautiful to see what he's doing behind that wall. As someone who saw the first piece, to really see the focus and it's him also. He's such an unbelievable presence communicator. When I saw the piece last weekend, in its online version, I was like, well, how is this going to work? It was so compelling when he touched my hand, and then I had sort of we had tried to make an escape from Abu Dhabi to take my son and I to take a weekend out of town, and I'd left quickly, and I'd left my laptop because we had to get a new COVID test, and it was all discombobulated. I got my son's laptop and I logged on, and there was Faisal, and it was like, oh, this immediately sort of centering, considered, it's incredibly compelling. And I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions about this, but if you haven't seeing the current running show, I drew on my own hand. And there's processes of drawing and erasure involved, and self-representation in making the work, and to do all of that yourself was just, it's a different piece, and it has echoes of the first. It's such a beautiful transformation. Really, congratulations. It's very special.
Thank you.
It's very special. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe we can talk a little bit. You mentioned in your bio, it mentions you're interested in exploring the ethics and politics of collaboration in your work, and it's so clearly a major part of the audience encounters. Can you share a bit about the nature of your work with Basil and what values you centered in that collaboration?
Yeah, so my collaboration with Basil, I think, is at least a try for it to be a reflection of the core values that I care about in collaborative work, but also in interactive work. All of my work is interactive. All of my work demands a certain kind of involvement of the audience. Most of the time, I think about the audience as a performer. I think of the audience as a co-creator. And we can discuss the politics and ethics of that at a later point. But in collaborating with another artist, but also with any person in making the work, some of the core values that I think about, first is the agency of the collaborators. So how can they feel that they've got agency, especially if they're representing their own story? So whose story is it to tell, and how is it represented, and do they feel completely comfortable with every aspect of how this story is being presented? And then interactivity, I think of interactivity as a principle. It's a balance between control and allowing some randomness to happen, embracing that randomness. So in fingertips, as far as my fingertips take me, I had the image of this whole piece, the concept of it, and then I shared it with Basil. And I asked him if he wants to be the performer and if he wants to create that song. For me, this was just an invitation, and I was ready to allow that piece to be completely shifted if Basil had other ideas or wanted it to be shifted. And it did shift in various ways. I mean, the song is a big part of the piece, and it was totally his work, that I didn't have any say in it. I think it was, in the case of Basil, it was important to position him as someone who has a balanced power vis-a-vis the audience. So he's not a victim just because he was born a refugee. That was very important to kind of maintain some sort of dignity in how people are presented. In fact, it's the audience who is placed, if you've seen, in the spotlight. So if you actually look at the performance space, there is a wall, there is a text, and the audience is asked to wear a white robe, and they become part of that scene that it's created, or image that it's created. And Basil has the choice to remain anonymous and invisible. So it was very clear that he has the choice to meet the audience if he feels like it or not. In the case of collaborating with Basil, there was also a question of respecting his choice to remain silent vis-a-vis speaking publicly. And that was a very important element to respect. And most importantly, I think it was to choose to co-author the work in the sequel. So we both have very equal power over how this work is presented, how it's marketed, how it's consumed, how it's spoken about. So it's no longer, in the next collaboration, it's no longer I'm making a piece where he's the performer, but also that we're both co-authoring that work together.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I mean,
I would add one thing is that in these, I mean, if we want to reflect on the ethics and politics of collaboration, it's important to think, to put it very simply, it's important to put people first before artwork, before the artwork outcome, especially when you're working in solidarity with certain communities. So it's about practicing the politics that you aim for through your work. It's practicing these politics through the process of the work, and knowing that the relationship with people is the most important element of the work rather than the outcome.
Yeah, and then the audience feels that immediately. We know what we're in the room with. We know where we are and what the center is. Maybe we can move on to talking about Garden Speak. Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
I have a clip. I have a clip from your website. Hold on a second.
So Garden Speak was the piece that, for those who weren't there or didn't know, it was the piece that I've shown first at the Art Center at the NYUAD, and that was in I want to say 2006, no, 18?
I think 18.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
Wait, Bill will zoom back in and zoom out.
Be like, no.
Yeah. Let me play this, and I'll just let the audience know that it's quiet at the beginning. There's text on the screen, and then later there's sound. So your sound is working. Okay. Right?
ضرب الخناجر وعلى حكم الندلبية شهيدنا البطل أغلى من العالي مفتاح درب الأمل والأمل برجالي يا شعبي نو يا بطل أفديك بعيني يما مويل الهوى يما مويلية ضرب الخناجر ولا حكم الندلبية.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your process on making that work, and in particular that the process of engaging the many communities that I know you sourced the material from and partnered with in what even the shape of the work might be, and also the scale of activation for the audiences in this piece is really profound. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so Garden Speak was put together, I would say, in 2013 in Beirut, but I often think about when did it actually start and when did it actually end, if it ever ended. And it's not very kind of easy to answer that, because it has been a long project that has an afterlife, which is a weird thing to think. If it tells 10 stories of 10 people who were killed at the beginning of the Syrian uprising. Yeah, so the piece had various layers of interactivity. One interactivity we can talk about, one aspect of interactivity in the very beginning of collecting these oral histories, interviewing various people, activists, journalists who were in Syria at the time, but people who came to Lebanon and relocated at the beginning of the uprising. We had big numbers of Syrian activists, but also various communities who came to Lebanon at the time. And it was about kind of trying to find these stories and just understanding why there were cases of gardens or public parks burials in Syria happening. And just understanding why that was happening was very striking to me. That kind of relationship that was happening between the dead and the living, where the living wanted to protect the dead by actually preserving the narrative around their death, and that relationship, and how sometimes in oppressive and dictatorship regimes, the fight continue after you've been killed or tortured or your life ending, by kind of changing that narrative. So it was, for me, it was kind of, it started from a political motivation to tell these stories. And I had that image that wherever we are in the world, if we stick our ear to the ground, we will be able to hear the stories of people who were kind of buried in a house, kind of quickly, in places where we don't really imagine as being burial sites. Of course, being Lebanese, born early 80s during the Civil War, and kind of living with the aftermath of that civil war, and being aware or conscious that there are places that we now hang out in that can be the site of mass graves. And we're not allowed to actually dig those graves, or understanding what happened there, or bring justice for these people, just because the same warlords who were part of the civil war are now part of the Lebanese regime, from the president of the republic to any other minister. So being conscious of that reality is very much impacted how I looked at the Syrian uprising happening very close to Lebanon. I also come from a village on the border between Lebanon and Syria, so that connection was always part of my identity. So there was that interactivity aspect of it, to collect those stories, to understand what was happening. And then there was the interactivity and the collaboration with various Syrian performers and writers and musicians who happened to live in Lebanon at the time. Sadly, we lost most of them, who have relocated to Canada, Australia, all over the world, Europe, and also it's partly because of the Lebanese regime pushing them out. So in 2013, the art scene in Beirut was very different because of the presence of Syrian artists and activists, actually. So we've turned these oral histories into stories. They were written first in Syrian dialect. They were recorded. We've added some real foot sound that we were able to collect. And then the piece toured. And then we could talk about the interactivity with various audiences around the world with that piece, because that piece functions without any performers. It's the audience who walk in and transform an otherwise installation into a live performance with their bodies, with their presence, with them walking around that space, finding the tombstone that they each listen to one story, so they each go and find that tombstone. They dig with their own hand in the dirt, and then they put their ear to the ground. They listen to the story told in the first person, and they make that link, that relationship with that person who is no longer with us. So we could, the piece was translated into various different languages around the world. And then there was, I just want to add that then the books, then the stories, the oral histories were turned into a book that is published both in Arabic and in English. And at the very end of the performance, if you've seen in the video, people write a letter back to the person that they heard the stories, and they bury it in the ground. And these letters, there were thousands and thousands of them written in all different languages. It was also transformed into an installation where I share all of these letters, so people can come in and look at them and read some of them. And I think it's just, it's a beautiful, just kind of share of solidarity with people from around the world. So we can discuss the afterlife of that piece after, so it's not just the performance itself, but how it, before the performance and after the performance, it continued to exist in various ways. And I like to think about interactivity not only with the audience but with various communities and people.
I mean, it's really beautiful to hear you talk about the process of making the work also being a process of trying to understand the scale and nature of the situation and connect with it in as many ways as possible. As an audience member, we know that there are more stories than we get to hear. We know that we're hearing one story, but there are all of these other stories around us, and we lay down in the dirt and we form a single bond that's really profound. But we know we haven't grasped the whole thing. We get close to one part, but you can't, it feels like a piece that you can't hold the whole piece while you're attending it. It makes perfect sense that it would overflow into the exhibit. And even at the exhibit, I remember you telling me that there were some letters that had been seized in one location, and that, so you have this, the letters are overflowing in the exhibit, and there's it's an incredibly, in the end, it's an incredibly generous work. It's really...
those letters, for those who are interested, have been confiscated by the Tunisian police, and they continue to be. Boxes of letters were confiscated by the Tunisian police, who mistake them, took them for being just like propaganda letters written by some, I don't know, like Islamist fighters in Syria to invite Tunisian young men to go and fight in Syria. Hilarious. I mean, they understood that it was from an art project at the end, but they continued to just confiscate the letters.
I mean, the audience are the performers, but you do have your collaborator who's there to guide us into the work and get us into our raincoats and our boots, but also introduce us to the idea, to invite us to generously consider the piece. And it is really the way that you are able, I think, to take your curiosity that starts these works and feed them into the piece and give that curiosity and love really to the audience is profound in combination with the subjects. It's really meaningful. Now I'm just writing a fan letter, but I have to say that watching that clip again is really something.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wonder, did you have more you wanted to talk about with that piece, or?
No, just to mention, because you mentioned the audience guide, and I often think about the audience guide. Is the audience guide a performer? Is she not a performer? And I just think about audience guide as, I mean, I've used audience guide as well in my latest work called Cultural Exchange Rate, which is my most autobiographical or personal work to the day. And I think about the audience guide just as people who would, guide the audience, who would make sure that the audience know that this is an invitation rather than a rule. So it's not just kind of a set of rules that you have to follow, otherwise the piece will not be presented for you. But they understand that they have agency. Again, it's a word that I use a lot when talking about the work that I care about. And I think it's important to communicate instructions in a clear way, but also offering a space or creating a space in which the audience know that they can shift a little bit. So if the audience don't feel that they can touch the ground, they have, various capabilities in their bodies, they are emotionally touched in a way that they can't just perform these instructions, and they would like to shift it a little bit in a way that they feel comfortable, that the audience guide are there to actually support them doing that. It's like a human contact with the work.
Yeah, and I understand as an audience member that I'm not anonymous. I'm not part of a mass. I'm seen. The event sees me, actually me, and brings me inside the event. And I also remember when Garden Speak was at the Arts Center, that your version of a talkback was to sit on the modulus outside the event as the audiences of 10 came out, and just be present, just hang out and see if anyone wanted to talk. And it was no pressure, and we're all just sitting there. There was nothing formal about it. It was just an opportunity to connect.
Totally.
Yeah, it's really nice. So I want to talk a little bit about our students, our NYU Abu Dhabi students. The student body, as you know, comes from more than 120 countries. And for many of our students, the center of their creative work moves between and among multiple home sensibilities. Can you talk a little bit about the many places you sort source your work from, and how these influences sort of forged and challenged you as you were finding your voice as an artist?
Yeah, totally. And it's a conversation in which I'd like to hear from your student more about their own experiences in that. I mean, as artists, we find ourselves working internationally and working most of the time where we're invited. You know, in the example of Lebanese artists, for example, because we have very little, I'd say, non-existent public funding for the arts and very limited private funding. Many Lebanese artists tend to work internationally, where they can get commissions and where they can offer residencies and funding to make work. And we, because of that, we battle with translation. We battle with how our work can be geographically specific if we need it to be, but at the same time be understood globally. And we battle with the question of who is our audience, or how do we kind of create work that it's not necessarily made for the privileged art-goer gaze. How do we not present ourselves as the ultimate, victims, even though sometimes it is the case that there are victims of oppression. And how do we continue? And this is a question that it's relevant worldwide. How do we make work that it's very specific, that is very personal, at the same time it's global, it's international, it's political? We know that the personal is political, but how is it relevant to the whole world without it being just made for the outside eye gaze, you know? And there are various ways of doing that. Obviously, language is a big important of that element of that. I personally try to think about the site. So I've created lots of work that are site specific. And when you do that, when you work with the site, you have to engage with the politics of the site. And when you engage with the politics of the site, you're engaging with who are the users of that site, who feels that they are invited or excluded from that site, who uses it, who surveils that site, who controls it, etc. So once you battle with these questions and you engage with the politics of the site, you're engaging site specifically, and you're grounding your work with the locality where you are. Another way of, or another idea or notion to think about in relation to working internationally is collaborators. In various places, you're collaborating with different people. I gave the example of creating work in Beirut in 2013, how that impacted my work, because everyone around us, in terms of collaborators and people who we were seeing every day, were Syrian activists and artists. So that impacted my work, because the collaborators were who they were. When I worked in Tunis and I chose to, for example, to work with a women's shelter in the old Medina, that obviously shifted the work completely, because you're working with that site and the politics of that site, but also with that specific group of people, with that community. So that's my that's my answer to your question, is to think about the site and the politics of that site, and to think about who can you collaborate with in various locations. And these two things will impact and affect the work.
It's really excellent advice, because your advice suggests to not get distracted in what the audience wants, to not get distracted by an imagining of what the audience might be ready for or want, or how, but to stay in touch with what you are, where you are, and who you have, and build from there.
Totally, and not to be very not to predetermine who the audience will be and what they will feel. I think this is a very important idea to kind of keep when creating, or to remember when creating work, that to allow audience to surprise us with their reaction, or with their what they bring to the work, rather than predetermined from the beginning. I'm going to make work that will be seen by this community, and this is how I want them to feel and see and understand.
Yeah. We mustn't underestimate the audience. It's they are as complicated and filled with contradictions and things we don't expect as we are. They're reading something you don't think they're reading, and they're having conversations you don't think they're having, and they're listening to music you don't expect, and they're ready for your work. Maybe we should move to questions. Let's see what we have in here. Can you see the Q&A, Tania, or is it just me?
Yeah, I thought I started reading them. Sorry.
You started reading. Do you? Interesting question about how artistic expression might enable a resiliency or a hope when engaging subjects that, maybe we can do something the news can't. Maybe there's something
totally,
about,
of course. Yeah, of course, because I mean, the news don't really tell the stories of ordinary people, how events are usually told from the point of view of the most powerful, but also events are told in a way that just completely erases the experiences, the dreams, the hopes of just ordinary people, whoever they are, whether they are they've done some heroic act, they were involved politically, they were good citizens, or they're not. These stories are not told, and I think this is where oral history as a practice is important, because it tells the history from below, and it just kind of corrects that mistake in what that humanity does in not in dismissing the stories of ordinary people. And this is where art comes to kind of take that oral history and make it more accessible, create it. So because oral history also as a practice can be just a collection of words or recorded testimonies that live somewhere, either in academic circles or in some kind of library. So art can be used to transform that oral history recordings into a more accessible telling of stories and histories.
I see. Yes. I see another question here about how you navigate the dangers that are posed, both real dangers and societal, that making art is when making art that's more explicitly political. What do you worry about?
Yeah, I think I think this shifts where depending on where you're making the work and how you're presenting the work. I think in my case, I didn't really battle real dangers, just had like few hate emails, some couple of ridiculous death threats, but nothing really serious, I would say. I mean, obviously, death threats are to be taken seriously. Don't don't learn from me, but I wouldn't say there were real dangers because of where I am, but also because of how the work is presented. The work is not presented as a spectacle that actually is made to shock people and to create a shocking message. It's presented in a very caring, almost like, you know, paying respect, mourning those who were killed. And I'd say even if you are from a very different political view and you come to that place, unless you're a complete monster, you're not actually you don't reject it because it's not propaganda. It's actually telling stories of ordinary people, and even some of these stories I don't necessarily what's the word, like I don't agree with all the acts that
Right.
all these people have decided. These are ordinary people, you know. If they were alive, talking in conversation with me, I would disagree with them and agree with other people or with them on other issues. So they're just ordinary people who have their mistakes and good sides, and it's about just telling that story. So I would say in how my work is presented, or the type of work form that I'm interested in, it is not does not call for a very kind of clashing response, and that's how I navigated it.
It's a really good point you make about the art making space being a place where we can lift forward divergent ideas encountering each other. We don't have to present a thesis. We don't have to. We can present ideas. You know, the idea that we can agree with is divergent voices coming together.
Totally, but it's not about presenting a balanced report. So it's not about kind of working in a media where we're saying, well, there are good people and bad people on both sides. You know, the dictators are okay, and the people who wanted their freedom are okay and bad. You know, it's not that. I mean, I clearly come with solidarity with people who chose to have political change wherever they are and call for freedom wherever they are in the world. And that piece was created at the very beginning of the Syrian uprising, where it wasn't even a war. It wasn't even an armed struggle at the beginning. It was just people with their bare bodies and facing 40 years of dictatorship. And for me, it was, I clearly come from a political motivation, and clearly with one side of this, you know, of that conflict. But at the same time, as you said, Joanna, it's a place that it's not aggressive in how it's presented its political ideas, but it's way more subtle. It's presenting people's stories rather than just spoon feeding you that these are just victims of a brutal dictatorship. It's understand that the mere act of telling people's stories is an act of resistance.
Yes. We have a question about wondering if you can reflect on your work with the Dictaphone Group Collective in Beirut and your critical interventions in public spaces. Do you consider these public interventions as a form of urban activism?
Yes. I mean, we don't present it as such. We present it as we present the collective Dictaphone Group as research and performance collective, but we've met as people who are interested in urban activism. And we definitely use tools that we use as activists on urban issues. We use tools that can be considered as info activism because we're mapping new information and presenting information that hasn't been spread widely before or publicly. So yeah, definitely there is an intersection there, but we don't present it as such for the same reason that this is not made in a way to create that spectacle in a public space, but to be very subtle about it, to invite. So sometimes it takes the shape of a tour, like a walk tour, a tour on a boat. So if you look at it from a distance, you just see a group of people doing a tour in the city. But actually, slowly, when you're into it, you understand that this is doing many things with a political potential. For example, sharing those information that weren't shared before, being present in spaces where our bodies are not welcome to be present, appearing in those spaces, building a collective memory with spaces that are contested, that they are threatened to be closed from the public, and how that collective memory with that space actually will end up forming a resistance against the closure of that space. You could watch some videos of Dictaphone Group online and on dictaphonegroup.com. We also tend to present the research findings in booklets, like designed booklets that are very easy to follow and accessible. We make sure that these are presented in Arabic first, because it's very important that knowledge is produced in a local language for us, even if it's academic knowledge or can be seen as academic knowledge. It's presented in language that everyone can understand and everyone can read, and then it can be translated into English at a later point. So Dictaphone Group was like some of other things to think about in terms of Dictaphone Group values is that intersection between urban research and live performance, accessibility and production of knowledge, and also to not be, to think outside institutionalized art and outside of the centrality of the capital. Because most of the art or contemporary art in Lebanon happens in Beirut and in art institutions. We tend to make work that happens in a public space that everyone is welcome to, that exists after the performance and exists in a way that it's accessible and open access to people online and in various ways through these booklets, sound pieces, etc. And that is not just centered around the capital, but happens in various cities in Lebanon as well.
I mean, my experience on a Dictaphone tour, it's profoundly effective what you do with your colleagues, because we went out on a boat, out into the water, and there's, the magic of site-specific work is that your body has a memory of being in a place, and that kind of place, being outside, being in the ground, being in a basement, being in a field, your body responds to that, and your mind begins to think the kind of thoughts that you have when you're in a place like that. It's different. So we're out on the water, and it's beautiful to go out on the water. You have to step into a boat, and you have to help people get into a boat, and the boat's kind of small, and then you're on the water, and the water's rocking, and Beirut is beautiful. And we're out on the water in that place that you're in that place. And then we look at the shore and we consider that the beaches are supposed to be accessible to everyone, and they're not right now. And we're we're in this open place that we're in when we're on the water and we're thinking about these things. And I've never, honestly, since that little boat ride and tour, I've never seen a shoreline the same way again. As you think about, it's true, as you think about who has access, and that the power of place where I had access being considered to look at that is really, it's super effective. We're having some questions about the Zoom environment as a location, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about making work online, and you know, maybe reflect on the contemporary moment with all of the pandemic related restrictions challenging the way that we previously understood performance and audience and theater. I wonder how you think about live art in this moment, or if it's shifted, or.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't have a lot to add to the conversation on the Zoom and what does it add and take. I would just say that I like to work with obstructions. I like the challenge of being forced to be innovative in the form, because innovation is a big part of the work that I'm interested in creating, but also that I enjoy as an audience member. So to work with that obstruction or constraint on how to turn just a kind of an online space into an intimate space is something that I would find interesting as a challenge. And I try to do it with this piece. And if I had to do other pieces, I would also think about that. In terms of the moment, yeah, I mean, the pandemic have turned an already precarious space for art workers into a devastating place where many artists are struggling to survive, especially people who just rely on continuous production and touring. And I think there is an opportunity right now to reflect on that industry and how it functions, and maybe to try to create a more sustainable way of being an artist, working in performance, working in any sort of event, even as musicians. I don't think it is healthy or sustainable to continue to just be trotting the globe to be able to survive, or to just continue to overproduce all the time, creating new work all the time, but maybe think about slow art, that it's maybe it's research-based, that allow us to create deep inquiries rather than just produce and tour around the world at festivals. I know we all miss that, and I'm an avid traveler, and I loved my life just jumping from one festival to another. But actually being forced to be in one place for almost a year now made me kind of reflect on whether this is sustainable to continue to do that, and whether we should find art policies that support people, support these silent moments, these inquiry times where we can just, not produce and reflect on our careers and just engage deeply with new ideas.
I totally agree. Just totally agree. And I, although I am a little nutty to not be traveling around, it's strange to be still, because the whole sustainability of a mid-career artist in this field is moving, it's to think about what the practice is when the practice isn't. How do you practice as an artist when your practice isn't always being late for somewhere, or packing your suitcase, or arriving just when you need to and then leaving just before you want to, and coming home a little later than you should, and but to actually be still and find what you do, discover what you do. I read different things, I think different thoughts. It's a really different time, and it's it's profoundly valuable.
Totally.
There's a question about Garden Speaks that I think is a really wonderful process question about how you find and approach the people you interview, or the people who carry the stories you want to tell, and are they always ready to share their stories? How do you navigate that space? And there was another super interesting question around, what if you want to tell your story for a certain audience, but they're not the audience you have? What if you're really wanting to speak to people that you may not reach for whatever reason of geography? And so how do you find and collect the stories, and then where do you go with that?
So
maybe?
I try to convey this idea that I use interactivity as a practice, that it's on the various layers of the work. It's a very clear notion for me, but I'm not sure if I communicate it clearly to people. For me, interactivity is a research engine that starts from researching the work to present in it. And while researching the work in that particular project, it's about making kind of conveying interviews with people. And I think about it as an interactive, almost one-on-one performance, where I try to practice the same values that I care about in one-on-one performances, and that's shared vulnerability, shared care, where the person that I'm interviewing know that they have agency in how the stories are being told, know that they can interrupt the process and shift it, know that they can decide. I've had various examples where people say, sorry, please do not put this. I changed my mind. I'm no longer comfortable in that. In an example of Garden Speak, there are moments where people told the stories. We went back and wrote the story in the first person, and then send it back to the people who we've interviewed, so they can check it, see if they're comfortable with it, and maybe even propose some edits. Can you repeat the second part if I didn't answer it?
Yeah, it was just a question. I know it's anonymously submitted, but I just
Just closing my door. I'm hiding from my daughter.
I know, I love it. I know we're running out of time. I can't imagine Lael's gonna make it much longer.
Gonna be give me my food.
Yeah, exactly. Often the opportunities come where your audience isn't, depending on what the home base for the source of that particular work is. And it can, the question about how much to translate yourself, how much to imagine the other audience and see what these people who don't have those shared experiences, who are your audience, see what happens.
Yeah.
It's tricky to find your footing.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know how to answer this question, to be honest, because I push myself to not think about audience as identity. So I think about audience as performance in a way that I always ask, who are my audience? And it's never like, oh, this particular identity of people, these kind of middle age, middle class, white, or any sort of race, ethnicity, all of that, nationality. I try to think about my audience. For example, in Garden Speak, who is my audience? My audience are a group of people who are coming to visit the graves of their loved ones. So they are performing that, their friends and families of those deceased. This is how I think about them. In that way, they choose to perform that role however they wish to perform that role. And this allows for these audience to be whoever they are. You know, they could be from like Australia, where that piece has been presented, to Tunisia, where it was. I'm choosing the very first show and the very last show. They could be, whoever they are, but they are performing that role that I invited them to perform. And I found that kind of useful for me. I don't know if it's useful for the other people, but I force myself not to think about people as identities, because it just doesn't work that much for me.
Thank you. I have a question about whether or not can you talk about, are there other Lebanese artists who you feel your work is in conversation with?
It's hard for me to say that. There are so many Lebanese artists that I like and that that I'm interested in, but not necessarily that my work is in conversation with, because my work is, I guess it uses a form that it's not that common in Lebanon, and sadly not common in the Arab world. And it does its own thing. My work is in conversation with many activists, urban activists, and people who work on the intersection of art and politics in Lebanon, feminist and queer artists that are in Beirut, for example, and there's a whole list of them. But the form is not necessarily a common form, I would say.
Thank you. One last question, if that's okay with you, Tania, is that okay? Do we have time for one more? The question is, are there elements or issues that you've consciously chosen to keep out of your art? And then the person wants to know, what are these things, which maybe you don't have to say, and why have you chosen to keep them private? If there's elements of your work that you decide to keep private.
No, I don't. I can't think of anything that elements of my work, or is it subjects that I can't put in my work? I don't really understand the question. Is it like if I am doing any sort of self-censoring? I would say no, I haven't done any self-censoring related to me as a person. It's more not really censoring, but kind of omitting things from my work just to preserve whether the safety of people who are telling their stories. If they choose to be anonymous, we anonymize names, or if they change their mind about certain elements of the stories. These were omitted from the work.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tania. I think we are at time. Thank you, Tania.
Thank you, Joanna. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, you know that we talk quite often, but it's nice to talk publicly and professionally, not about life and work and love and motherhood and everything else we talk about.
Well, it's a complete pleasure. And even though I'm in the Zoom and I'm your moderator, and it's being recorded and it'll be on a YouTube channel, I'm taking notes because it's really a pleasure to hear how you think about making work. It's really a pleasure. It's an absolute treat. And to the audience, our viewing audience, I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There are a lot of them. Tania and I both really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness, because every question in this Q&A is a profoundly caring consideration of how to bring stories forward, how to bring yourself forward, how to create community, how we work together to build the body of stories we want. It's honestly, the Q&A itself, I hope, is published somewhere, because you all are really thinking about what you want to do and how you might want to do it with care and purpose. And it's a real pleasure to read the Q&A, actually. So thank you, Tania.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us.